see you.
Likewise.
And it's great to see Vermont Digger behind you. Welcome back to Senate Education Tuesday, Valentine's Day, 2:51. Education quality standards. According to my notes, Senator Hewitt raised a concern, and I think it's one that we all have, around educational quality standards as it relates to our independent schools in particular. And we have St. Johnsbury Academy coming back in to answer some of Senator Hewitt's questions. But before we do that, before they do come in, I thought we might just take a moment and just understand educational quality standards in general in the state. One of the things that some people may say we do too much of or not enough of, this committee, and I think it's true of health and welfare and natural resources also, there's so much policy and there's so much that has to be taken in. Institutions, gov-offs, I mean, let's be honest. What do they really do? I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
You missed it.
I'm kidding.
You missed
I'm
it.
kidding.
What was that?
No, I was kidding. I'm talking about institutions and gov-offs.
You're gonna get me in trouble.
No. But this is, there's just heavy policy. So anything you can help us with EQS would be great.
Sure. Happy to be back here. For the record, Dr. Heather Boucher, Deputy Secretary for Education here. By the way, I'm not sure I said this. I'm in my 8th year as the Deputy Secretary.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, I think.
Yeah,
are in
good.
order. Sure. I love it. It's good work. I think we have a fantastic education system. I'm not sure I actually had a chance to kind of tell you that. And, you know, I've been working in this area for quite some time now. So I thankfully thought that kind of an overview of the education quality standards might be what you were looking for. I know that you had Amanda Garces and Diego who are on the Act One. Amanda is the chair of the Act One working group, and I actually had prepared this presentation, an earlier version of this, for that group to kind of walk through what exactly are education standards, where do they come from, what do they mean, who do they pertain to, all those questions. And I think that you will see a couple of slides that are probably familiar to you given that last week's testimony. I am actually a member of the Act One working group too. So that creates a nice, I think, interface for us to make sure we're doing things kind of according to the on that work group according to the process that's set forth.
In your introduction, if you could just show how they mesh. Are they one and the same? You talk about, you know, Act One and EQS. How do they, where do they come together?
Sure. So they're not the same. So Act One was a particular law that was passed, I believe, session 4. Okay, so it's been a while, 4 years ago. That did a variety of things, but the primary piece was to form a working group with a set body of different entities, stakeholders around the state who could all inform the conversation about what we call ethnic studies, also related to things like social justice. Really what this was about was how do we ensure that our education system is meeting the needs fully for all of our students, in particular students who come from what we might term historically marginalized backgrounds. We actually met yesterday and we had a really rich discussion about like, what are these terms that we use? And so I'm kind of like thinking, we didn't come up with anything that we want to use because we're still having that conversation. But at the time, we would say historically marginalized. Sometimes you hear students of color, BIPOC populations. And so for many folks, just as an aside, those don't really seem to resonate with them individually. And that's kind of what we were having that conversation about last night. But again, I said that was an aside. So Act One really was about how do we actually, and it was framed around a couple of studies in Vermont and then some national work that had shown the education sphere is one where we really need to make sure that all students feel welcome, feel safe, feel that they see themselves in the instruction and the curriculum that they're taught every day. So in a nutshell, that's what Act One is. And I'm doing it, I'm sure, quite short shrift. So EQS is what the State Board of Education, and I'll talk about this in just a sec, what the State Board of Education developed. The first version of it was back in the early 1980s, I believe 84, 85. And it was in response to Title 16, like a real core aspect of Title 16, which actually said the state board is responsible for the quality of education. And so they went through a process where they actually came up with rules, which is what the EQS are, their 2200 rules series, that actually spelled out at that time, here's what the State Board of Education for Vermont is requiring in terms of our education quality for the whole system. And then over time, the last version of the EQS was so over time with rules, and this is the part where I'm not sure you've actually had some of that introduction to like literally as basic as like, here's how laws are made and what happens to them afterwards. I can go into that a little bit. And that's on some of the slides I have. But so rules, like law, like occasionally need to be or regularly need to be updated. And so that's what happens with that is what's happened with the EQS as well. The last time they were updated was 2015. How they interface, which is a great question, is that, and I can talk about this a little bit in the presentation, the Act 1, part of what was required of the Act 1 working group was to look at the education standards, and then also to look at, to the extent feasible, to look at practices in local school districts, local policies, those kinds of things. So, and this is the Act 1 working group is a great collaborative of a lot of folks from the community. And so they are not as steeped even as any of us in kind of like this kind of stuff. Like a lot of the work that we all do is of course it's not plain English. So they needed, most people would, my entire family would not understand what the heck I do if they actually looked at what I write every day. So we spent a lot of time actually making sure that all members of Act 1 understood this process. And that's where this presentation initially started from. So because of that, the working group, the Act 1 working group started with the state education standards, because again, that is sort of the marching orders for all of our LEAs from the State Board of Education that says, here's what thou shalt do in terms of provisioning quality for education. So it made sense for the working group to say, all right, let's start there. We want to make sure that we have a lens that is really framed around equity and framed around making sure all students are, covered, addressed, taken care of in these education standards. So that's kind of a broader background. I thought I might jump into, it's not a very long presentation, so I thought I might just jump in and just kind of walk through some of those pieces, if that's okay.
Sure. And you're talking about this presentation?
Yes, yes. I also provided a link. I think Maureen sent separately a link to the actual education quality standards.
Yes, I think yours has been
yeah. And so you can actually see, from a more concrete perspective, what actually is in them. And then at the end, I'll talk about where we currently are with the EQS, because right now they're not open officially, which is a thing. And I'll talk about what that means, but there's work happening on them because of Act 1. So the second slide there is really a little bit of just a high order of like, how is state education policy developed? And, I can't really speak to other spheres. It might be different. All I can speak to is education. But in typical, it's ideally, this is what happens. So, and this list goes from more general to more specific as you go down these bullets. So the General Assembly passes a statute, passes a law. Then the State Board of Education typically is asked to enact rules based on that statute. Sometimes not, if the law is so crystal clear that you don't need rules to go along with it. But more often than not, particularly in education, it's complex. And so there are often a need for rules to actually really spell out how that would look. Yeah.
So one of the things that anyone knows that we've asked is, how did we get proficiency learning? Lead Council says it's not in a bill.
It's not in
So
jail.
what I'm wondering, and I did invite former Secretary Holcomb in.
Mhm.
She said, and I understand, she thinks perhaps Jeff DeCarowitz might be better when Jeff is back.
Yeah.
But we've heard from teachers and parents that have some concerns about it. Where did it come from? Who directed whom? Who?
The State Board of Education directed proficiency-based graduation requirements, which was their purview in rule.
Okay.
They didn't do anything wrong.
Okay. No, we're
Yep.
just trying to get to the
Sure.
meat of where did it come from? Because it's a big impact. It's had a big impact, whether people want to be
Yeah.
positive or negative, I don't know. But those kinds of things
Yeah.
happen, and it's important for us to
Yeah.
understand how they sort of get out there.
And that's kind of what I said. Ideally, this
Yeah.
is the way the process works.
Yeah.
But in the context of how the law is written, Title 16, the
Yeah.
State Board of Ed does have its own authority, and also probably at the time, like its own mandate, given what was happening in the state contextually. There was a lot of work going on with proficiency-based learning. It was tied very closely with flexible pathways. We can talk about that. So
But Dr.
that
Fisher, would
became,
it take the Secretary of Education to say, I want you all to look at this at proficiency-based learning and move forward? Or is it, if they can just,
at that time, and this is also another layer of complexity. So at that time, the State Board of Education would tell the commissioner at that time what to do, because the commissioner of education was actually employed by the State Board of Education.
the flexible pathways were done under Secretary Holcomb?
But this work started during that
Okay.
transition to her. So at the same time she came in and we
Yes.
became a secretary, the
Yes.
role became a secretary and was
Yeah.
part of the administration. And I will say that happened, but it's still taken us some time, and we're still not even, I think, 100% there of actually cleaning up all of the legislation that
Yeah.
we keep finding little tiny things every now and then where it's like, oh, we're no longer a department of education. So there was a period of time where it was a bit of a gray area
Absolutely.
in terms of like who was on first. So I know that my predecessor, John Fisher, if that rings a bell,
Yes.
was who was really, a strong leader in terms of proficiency-based learning and flexible pathways. So I think it was both coming from, at that time, the Department of Education and also the State Board of Ed. But the
It's
State
just-
Board
yeah,
of Ed,
that's helpful.
okay, they decided like we're going to go with proficiency-based graduation requirements. And so then our obligation was, okay, that's in rule, meaning our obligation of at that critical moment when it was probably passed, I can't remember, department/agency, and then to be the agency, because we were in that transition.
Yeah.
It was still our role to then translate that for the field. And so a lot of the work that Jess has done is all of that translation, which is under the state the state agency of education. The third bullet is the developing of guidance and the
Yeah.
technical assistance and the best practice examples and professional development and learning, all of that stuff.
So could this still happen under the new structure? The State Board of Education says we're going to move in a certain direction, whether voters or there's no legislative process. Can that still?
Well, right now we're in another kind of interesting space. And so part of the interesting thing about our agency is that the rest of the agencies all have, to my knowledge, the rest of the agencies in our Vermont government system have their own rulemaking authority as an agency. We never had that. So that was one of those funny things that was still under this Board of Education. And this is where the district quality standards piece came in. So that is the Agency of Education's first foray into, now as an agency, we're doing rulemaking. So we will run the whole process of rulemaking, which is a process. You have to take lots of stakeholder feedback. You have to actually get approval through two ICAR and LCAR committees that are I think, within the bowels of the governmental system. And I think also they might have, I was going to say they have legislators on that as well. Yeah.
I feel pretty good now.
So right now, we're still working under EQS that are owned by the State Board of Education.
Okay.
And you'll see when I think we're going to come and give an update on the DQS, which are district quality standards, and you'll see sort of how both of us, the State Board of Ed and Agency of Ed, we've worked together, have thought of that conceptually, because I don't think anyone is interested in a heavy divorce between these two. That's not good for our education system in general. We want to be working together always.
Okay, good. No, Joey Donovan I was against any kind of divorce. And then when Shumlin and Donovan and others said, no, we've got to move to the secretary, I was like, oh no, and now I get it. And I like moving more, my instincts are to move more in that direction.
I think that's a little bit of a different divorce. That was like first divorce phase one.
Right,
and I'm talking about if we are going to have a State Board of Ed, which I think we are committed to at this point, then it's important that the Agency of Education continue working very closely with that State Board of Ed.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Yes.
It's all murky. It's very murky. So I hope that I'm providing some clarity for this. And then the LEAs, I've used that lingo, you've probably heard it. So that's for local education agencies. For us, that basically means the districts. Technically supervisory unions or districts because we're interesting in Vermont, but basically it's districts. And they develop then, as a result of all of the guidance and the technical assistance, they develop their own policies that are in line with the law, the rule, and the technical assistance, ideally, that they've received. The State Agency of Education stuff is typically not mandatory. So it's more guidance and technical assistance. You saw though, I could just wax poetic on this, so stop me off. But so you saw though, when we had the COVID state of emergency, I don't know if you'll remember this, because the governor declared a state of emergency, it allowed the secretary at that time to actually have the word of law, not law, but the word of rule that said, this is what we're going to do. It's mandated. So without that state of emergency, that's not what the agency has the authority to do. And this comes up quite a lot because, we're often in a spot where folks get frustrated, rightfully so, with the agency and they're, why can't you do this? Why can't you, why can't you fix this? And often we say, we understand that would need a new law or that would need a new rule because I could think of an example some other time to share about that. But so it's kind of heady stuff, but I think it's important to kind of just keep in mind, there's a lot of different players. There's a lot of different roles and responsibilities for folks. And then I just give you an example of that back to, oh gosh, why did I use this as the example, right? Pre-K. This was Act 166. There's a lot going on in pre-K, as we know. I'm now on slide 4. And I was trying to use this to explain that the Act 1 work, and this really gets at your question, Mr. Chair, the Act 1 work was really about the working group actually carrying out their charge that was in Act 1 and starting by looking at the State Board of Education rules. And there are many different rules. EQS is one set of rules. I will say right off the bat, the current instantiation of EQS does not pertain to independent schools. It pertains only to public schools. Doesn't pertain to approved independent schools. It only pertains to public schools. And so part of what the recommendations were from the Act 1 working group, and I'll move into that now. So the Act—
Well, before that, can you just give us an example then of something that the public would be required to do under EQS that the independent school just
class size.
Class size.
So that we have in some of the EQS there's a little sort of not really a formula, but it has, and I don't have it memorized, but it has the student teacher ratio that is I don't even know if it's required, but it's strongly suggested in that rule. There are similar ratios for student counselor to teacher, or student counselor, to student ratios, those kinds of things. So the whole, another complexity, the whole aspect of licensure But that's actually not the State Board of Education, just to clarify and confuse things even more. That's actually the Standards Board,
Sure.
separate entity. So there are a variety of
That's helpful.
things like that
It helps
that
me understand
yeah,
what's
that are
sort of in
spelled out.
that, yeah.
All of this. So for instance, no independent school will be required to set up a multi-tiered system of support, which is really critical to Act 173, which you might heard of. So since 2015, that instantiation of the EQS really was heavy on MTSS. And so that's when that was required. And we built up a team in the agency. We have an MTSS team. They've done a lot of work and they really help local, both districts and schools build up that system. Is that helpful?
Yeah, and just to refresh my memory, S-173, Act 173, we passed largely having to do with special education.
Correct.
Correct. Okay, we did hear from the fellow from St. John's Berry on this a little bit last week.
Yeah.
I just want to keep all my acts
Yeah.
in
And
order.
you know, and that's, I think, an interesting thing too. So another piece, and this is actually bleeding more into federal regulation, but our independent schools are not obligated to partake in our state assessments.
Mhm.
However, our four academies, historically public high schools, so that would be St. J, which you heard testimony on, LI, the Linden Institute, Thetford Academy, and Burr and Burton Academy have always decided that they actually want to do assessments,
Right.
like the publics. And so that's another funny and interesting practical layer that a lot of the, I don't know, I shouldn't say a lot, some of the independent schools actually want to do what's in the EQS. They might feel differently if it was mandated.
Okay, thank you.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. So there are a bunch of different, and maybe it might make sense to actually look at the EQS and just walk through, because I think that'll give you a flavor of like what is in them. And then also, I'm not going to steal my boss's thunder, but I could give you a little prelude about why the DQS are coming and might be necessary.
Great. So you want to shift to this stuff?
Yeah, I kind of mapped out sort of the high level in that PowerPoint presentation. The first section is the statutory authority. This is for the 2000 series. So as I said, it really stems from right up front in 16 VSA, 164 and 165. It really kind of jumps into the core of our education system. So you can see some kind of required non-discrimination language up front. And I wanted to bring us to, then there's a whole section on definitions. And by the way, this document is what is currently sitting, a revised version of this is currently sitting with a subcommittee of the State Board of Ed. And I'm not going to speak to that because that would not be my purview, but that might be a really great thing for you if you would like to hear testimony from the co-chairs of that subcommittee, Tammy Colbay and Kim Gleason, because they are now taking the recommendations from the Act One working group and working them through and taking a lot of their own testimony on like what makes sense to do. And we have provided some technical corrections to them on some of that. But in general, you know, we're in agreement with a lot of what, I mean, I was working on it myself. So, you know, there's been a lot of crosstalk between our entities, the Act One working group and the agency. So I'm showing you what's currently on the books. These are actually going to change in the next year based on what the Act One working group has put in place. I don't necessarily think, and again, I want to be careful because they're not, we don't own them. The Agency of Education doesn't own them. I don't know necessarily if the structure is going to change, right? You're going to probably have the same structures with some additions, but you will see that it will have a lot more focus on those pieces that I talked about with ensuring that all students from diverse, varied backgrounds are feeling at home in the curriculum and instructional practice in a lot of this. So I think the first section, and I'm just going to do high level, is what we might anticipate, which is curriculum and instruction. So this is 2120, and it is on page 4 of the EQS document. So here's where you start to see, and it's not proficiency-based learning, but it does get personalization comes in. Instructional practices shall promote personalization. This is where they first came in, to my knowledge, in this 2015 version of the EQS. So personalization and this notion that really students should be driving their learning, they should really be engaged, and part of that is to actually personalize to the extent we can the lessons that they're exposed to, and sort of like allowing them to kind of craft and create their own unique types of ways of showing proficiency, and of also incorporating material that really speaks to them into things like projects and into papers and those kinds of things. This is one example. You start to see that kind of come in here with the personalization. Flexible pathways actually is a direct link to statute, because at the same time, Act 77 was passed by y'all, which is which is Act 77 of, I believe, 2013. Mm-hmm. And so this follows that process that I was talking about. So Act 77 was passed. Then here, under curriculum and instruction, is a whole section teeing up. We've got these things called flexible pathways now, and we're speaking to them. And it lists them out just as Act 77 does. Career and technical education comes next. Just as one example of how this process is iterative, we recommended that Act 77 in the statute actually incorporate career and technical education into it, because on the ground and with Act 77 originally, it talked about CTE as one of the flexible pathways. So the General Assembly agreed with us, and so they're now under this broader umbrella of Act 77 flexible pathways. So there still is a separate section, certainly, because there needs to be given its complexity for career technical education. But the idea was we want to actually make sure that these are seen not as kind of competing separate issues. So a flexible pathway would be CTE, would also be adult education, adult basic education. And I know a lot's going on in CTE, and I'm happy to talk at another time about that. I'm happy to talk anything, about anything with you all. Personalized learning plans was brand new. So I hope folks have heard of PLPs. They are not the same thing as individualized education plans, which are required by federal law for students who are on individualized education plans. That was a big piece of professional work we had to do in the field, because people were actually conflating the two and saying, oh, they've got a PLP, so they don't need an IEP. And we were like, absolutely not. These are not the same. You know, they're not. Like, there's one is definitely required by federal law. PLPs are required by state law, and PLPs are for all students. So that's a really
required, but any idea of how it's going in the field?
I think that we do assurances every year, and so largely meaning like they have to assure that they're 7th through 12th graders, which is what's in rule, actually in law, I believe. That one I have to go back and check. But I think it's in law, actually. So the 7th through 12th graders have to have personalized learning plans. As you might imagine, the first couple of years, they needed a lot of supports to get there. And the first couple of years, it ended up being almost like kind of a checklist, which was not great, right? So it was kind of like, that's not really the whole point of a personalized learning plan, is so that kids are having conversations with adults that can care about them and inform them and actually help them make choices through high school, late middle school and high school to get to what they're looking for afterwards. So I would say certainly COVID, COVID, and I know we keep saying this, but it's true. COVID, just put like a halt to a lot of things. So in particular, we would, I'm very curious to see what our assurance is. And when I say assurances, every superintendent has to basically sign off and agree to a variety of federal and state mandates and laws and obligations. And this is one of them every year. And so they have to say, like, I can assure that all of my 7th through 12th grade
I
students
see.
have a personalized learning plan. We've never had 100% on that. I think sometimes that's because we've had a lot of turnover in terms of leadership, as you've probably heard as well at the administrative level. But I think that there's been incredible progress. And so I, you know, again, we need to relook at that now that we've been through COVID and see like, okay, this still really is something that's important. We made a lot of effort to ensure that, for instance, you have to have a PLP if you're going to do dual enrollment, because that's how it links to the rest of your experiences. If you're doing early college, you should have a PLP. If you are in CTE, you should have a PLP. So we tried to kind of like bring these pieces together from the agency, because again, it was kind of just this like checklist thing. Like, okay, at some point they talked about their interests in their 4 years. That's not really what we were talking about. I think any of us, the General Assembly or the state board or the at the time department, right? We really wanted these to be rich conversations.
Ownership around their education, and like you said, have some good conversations with not only faculty, but people outside the building.
And parents.
Parents,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
So, you know, and as you might imagine, I think the more resourced districts had no problem with this. You know, they had the resources to build something new in and kind of go with it. They might have had multiple school counselors already that could build this into their system. A lot of folks ended up using teacher advisories, which has been a really nice model throughout the state, particularly in some of our more rural areas where even before our crunch on workforce, you know, they weren't able to have maybe not be fully staffed with a full-time school counselor. By the way, it's not guidance counselor anymore, it's school counselor. Just so you know.
I will make that mistake.
I
so
do,
do I.
it's fine too.
Yeah.
And I get that because they do a lot more now than guidance, that's for sure. So curriculum content is the next piece. Is this completely boring you all, or is this?
I'll be honest, this is helpful to me. I don't know if it's helpful, you know, just to understand again this, you know, these, you know, what really does fall. I mean, listen, I've only been the chair for a little over 2 years, so I'm still completely taking it in.
Yeah.
And this is particularly helpful.
Yeah, good. I just wanted to check in as a teacher because if
But we
it's
have
not, I
only
can
a few
shift.
minutes.
Okay.
So, yeah, any kind of.
This one is really, I think, important though, because and this one can get confusing. So the curriculum content lays out here, and this will, I think, change. You'll see from what I can tell from what is happening with the current the deliberation on EQS right now. It's more adding to what's in here and fleshing out some things. But this is where things get a little confusing. And so the EQS say, here's the curriculum content. You have to have literacy. You have to have math content and practices. You have to have scientific inquiry and content knowledge. You have to have global citizenship. You have to actually have phys ed and health education. By the way, many places do actually do mental health and health education. We can talk about that because I know that you have some testimony on that, and I'd be happy for us to come back and talk more about that. Arts, art expression. Then on top of that, we actually, and this is within the purview of the State Board of Education's authority. So it didn't have to come through the state, but the State Board of Education adopted specific academic state standards. So they adopted the Common Core state standards for English literacy, ELA, and math, and the next generation standards for science, and the C3 standards for social studies. And so that's a little confusing because that's not listed out in the EQS, but it was part of the deliberative process of the state board. And they took testimony and had stakeholder engagement on those as well.
Is Common Core listed anywhere in this?
No, it would be listed in the minutes and the meeting logs of the year that we as a state adopted them. And so that's exactly what I'm saying. Like the rules are not that specific, I think intentionally. And
I don't
then
know how teachers keep it. I mean, it's
Byzantine.
it's just a lot of levels.
a lot of levels.
It's a lot of levels of stuff.
It's a lot of levels.
And I'm not here to endorse nor.
No, I understand. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Boucher in terms of what we've heard and lack of understanding or an understanding now of the EQS? Because I think what we'll hear from, but I think in is it Dr. Kulik or is it Professor Kulik or Senator
Some
Kulik?
people do want to call me doctor or doc, but it's just, no, there's no doctor. Marcy.
I think, I hope this is helpful in terms of understanding some of what you want to talk to the head of St. Johnsbury Academy a little bit about. It
Definitely.
helps me to understand, again, sort of what's there and what, I think it's going to make for a more interesting
Yeah, and
conversation.
I don't know to what extent they're even familiar with the EQS. I mean,
Sure.
I really don't. I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't,
Well, stick around. I think she
yeah,
has
it doesn't
that. Yeah,
pertain
yeah.
to them. So, I mean, they may have, it doesn't legally, it doesn't,
Right,
I mean, they
right.
have their own, their separate process, which is they go through NEASC to get approval,
Right.
which this looks Byzantine, but
Well, that's good to know, because we have on our
NEASC is-
agenda whether or not, we know there are 11 public schools that do NEASC.
yeah.
Should everybody do NEASC, or should we, that kind of,
So I know, I think
We're not
I
gonna
saw
get
this
into it
come
right
up,
now.
no, but
Yeah.
I have them.
Yeah.
They're in a file in my
yeah.
office. If anyone wants to know what they are, because they're not required. So
Interesting.
when they come to me, I have just said, great, public
Yeah.
school X. I'm just gonna have this. And people, they've decided to do that because they
Yeah.
wanted that extra level of, I mean, it is more laborious than going through EQS
Right.
to do NEASC. There's no question about it.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, you have to do self-studies that are like
Yeah.
billion pages long.
The colleges, universities, it's something similar to
Yeah,
the National
it is.
Association.
They used to, which now Nietzsche used to be
Yeah.
NEASC, they used to do both.
Yeah.
All right, maybe I will stick around.
Yeah.
Curious now. Sorry.
Katie, would you see if, Dr. Howell?
My time management seems to stink lately. I feel like I'm
You're not
taking
alone.
double my time.
Oh,
You're
no,
not
that's
alone.
very helpful. Dr. Howell, nice to
By
see you
any
again. I didn't
means.
expect you to come in person, but please join us at the table. It's awfully nice of you.
Wow.
Come back. Yeah, I just got one too.
Hello again.
Hi, good to
Hi.
see you. It's been, I think, a couple of weeks,
It has.
and appreciate you coming back. Senator Bullock couldn't be here for the first time you were here.
Correct.
And so, some questions did come up. I'm not sure if it was, I think it was probably after your visit around, and Senator Bullock can direct these questions better than I, but I think generally around education quality standards and the academy and those kinds of things.
Mhm.
So am I articulating that pretty well, or do you want to,
Sure.
I don't want
But
to
I can
speak for you.
go.
I bet you can do better. Okay, please, go ahead.
Senator Kulik, nice to meet you. So my question was around EQS. So just generally speaking, as a state, we've decided that EQS is sort of the model that we live by, sort of our ethos, so to speak. We don't have a Regents exam like New York. We don't have graduation requirements or a mandated curriculum. So this is what we have. And my question to you is, as something that we've all agreed upon, and we're all going to follow this set of guidelines, or as I said, ethos. How is it, or why is it that St. Johnsbury doesn't follow EQS? You are a school that receives public dollars.
We are, yes.
So,
Yes. Thanks for the question. I've been thinking a lot about how, about this.
Dr.
So-
Howell, I just want to make
yes.
sure everybody who's watching understand, you are the head of
Oh, I'm
school right
sorry.
now.
Yes, the
at St.
headmaster at St. John's.
St. Johnsbury Academy.
Yes, yeah. So I don't know if you've heard from people in NEASC, the accrediting body that,
We had an
It's the New
overview
England
one day of what it looks like.
the house
basically.
has.
okay, well, I'm
Yeah, we did
I'm happy
too.
to talk
Yeah.
about it because it's the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, and they accredit schools that are tiny and, Harvard. So they have a lot of wide scope in the state, and in New England generally. So independent schools
all over New England trust NEASC. We've been accredited by NEASC.
No, I should go grab and ask self-study.
It's really quite a rigorous process. So it's on a 10-year cycle. And the first part of the cycle is a self-study that every school will do. And it is based on 15 standards. That these are the standards that we feel are appropriate for us. They're built for independent schools, and they are from operations and employee policies to school program. And I'm happy to leave this if that's helpful, because that as a first step forces the school to actually include a lot of people in understanding how they're feeling about how the school is running. Faculty and staff are really important there. So, and then they ask for a lot of material. So they ask for budgets and for policies and handbooks and lots of data and that evaluation. So, so then there's a committee formed, visiting committee. It's usually about 10 people, and it's peers from independent schools. And that committee does 2 visits. The first visit is really for operations. So I just did this down in Massachusetts at the Learning Center for the Deaf in Natick. So you go in with a little bit of a smaller group just to talk to facilities and the CFO and the admissions and HR to kind of cover the operations piece. And then write a short report. And then a couple of months later, the visiting committee in full comes and spends 2 days on campus. From pickup to drop off one day, or drop off to pickup one day, just to see how the school runs and talk to all the constituencies there, and observe classes and talk to parents. And it's really a very fulsome. And then the committee goes back, looks at this self-study, thinks about what they've observed and what the data is that they see, and then writes up reports and makes really clear and focused recommendations about what the school might do to improve. Obviously, if there are big things that need to be fixed, they're going to point to that. The school has a chance to respond for inaccuracies, not to make their argument. But then that report is completed, and it either adds up to being accredited conditionally, or being denied. After 2 years, there's another report. It's very brief, but it's really meant to track progress on recommendations. So it's looking at those, it's actually 14 standards for us. And just briefly, like, what have you done to address them? The 5-year report, which we just completed, and actually the AOE, we gave it to the AOE, that is more comprehensive and asks us to talk about real things that have changed, and the ways that we're thinking and planning. It asks for some strategic planning, thinking. So that's where we are right now. We submitted that in April of 2022, and I just realized that we're going to have to start our whole self-study process in 2025, because then they come in 2026. So
Yeah.
Please.
I just
the
hope
floor is
that's
yours.
helpful. No, that was really helpful. And in 2010, I did a NEASC.
Oh,
I was
goodness
teaching-
gracious.
No, it's okay. I was teaching at Essex High School, and we did the
Oh,
full,
you
so I
did.
helped write a portion of our, large document that we submitted. So
Okay, good.
I'm very familiar, but it was a good overview to hear it again. So thank you. Yeah.
And I think they have done some, when was it that you?
2010.
They have made some adjustments.
That's what
to
I've heard,
standards.
yeah.
I think they're overall
Yeah.
pretty positive.
Yeah, it seems like they're in touch more often now, which I think is a great thing.
with the school itself.
Yeah,
After.
it used to be like 10 years, and then 10
Yeah.
years, but now it's
Be monitored.
intermittent, yeah.
So how does this all connect into EQS? Or, I mean, it's not really connected to EQS, but it's, it's because as Senator Hewitt said, you don't have to follow the EQS. And maybe one way to ask it, are St. Johnsbury kids not getting something that the public schools are getting because you're not following EQS? That might be a way for me to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea because I don't know what's going
Sure,
on in all
sure.
the schools. And I am an independent school person, so I'm not an expert on those standards. But I guess what I would say is, these are both systems of accountability, mechanisms to be held accountable for the things that you're being asked to do. And the things that you say you do according to your mission. The EQS, as far as I can tell, is a very helpful set of standards for the public schools. And there are a lot of things that we do that are very similar to any school and any public school. And I really want to be careful not to make it seem like I don't like public schools. I respect and admire and want to work with public schools. But the NEASC accreditation process and that whole set of standards is our accountability mechanism, right? So those are the standards that we have been using. They do need adjustment sometimes. I actually met with the State Board of Education maybe in December. And they were asking about this, and one of the things they were focusing on was the kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. I know ethnic studies is a piece of what you're talking about these days. But they were concerned that we weren't going to be held accountable to these standards that the state had said, this is what we want to make sure is happening in every classroom. We want to make sure that kids are learning accurate history and that they're belonging and feeling like they belong, and they're being treated equitably, right? So we talked with the state board, and NEASC was there, and one of the things that was suggested was a Vermont state addendum that could go into the NEASC process for Vermont schools that really addresses very, very specifically, and we would work on it. It wouldn't be sort of wholesale from EQS, I don't think. But we would work on creating an addendum that made sure that everybody felt comfortable was, we are accountable to do these things with our students and make sure that our institution is doing A, B, and C.
So along those lines, one of the things I think you raised was what is happening around, maybe by my mother's memory, I generally remember things that other people say, but I could have this wrong, please, if I'm not accurate. Ethnic studies, DEI, what is happening at the academy?
So I just want to set the record straight.
Please.
I'm not sure how this misapprehension got out there, but I'm hearing that there's some sense that the academy is refusing to teach ethnic studies.
I think there was something, maybe an article that perhaps a Digger
Is that
article
right?
that was also possibly referenced in the committee.
You're right.
So I just want to make, yeah.
Yeah.
Does that sound
Your
accurate?
mother's memory is better than mine.
No, I think now that you mention it.
Yeah, I think that was
fair.
part of what happened. Yeah.
And I remember the feeling I had was like, that's absolutely not, it is just not the case. And, we not only teach, I was just talking to my academic dean today saying, can I get up to date on what exactly we're doing? And we just approved the AP Black History course and the AP World course that has a new set of standards around multicultural subjects. So we're also, we really already unequivocally are committed to making sure that kids are getting this information and are learning how to find the truth and to speak to each other in ways that will get them to the truth. And we also want to help our folks who've been on the staff for a long time and who have, reflexes about what they do, like hiring and like discipline, to take a look at those processes and policies. And so we did hire a consultant and for the year, and she is looking at across the board at everything that we do as a school. And I know there are a few different elements to it. So the policy and practice, institutional policy and practice is one piece. The helping students in the moment to feel that they, like community education, right, around how do we make this the most equitable school, faculty, board. And the board is just absolutely all in on this. So I think, you can't really make any progress if you don't have some energy from the top, which is why the state standards, I think it's exciting that that's happening. Then there's the curriculum. I think we're looking at all of those things and have already made some progress in terms of student leadership and faculty leadership. And one thing that I appreciate a lot of things about being about an independent school, and I have a lot of them written here that I appreciate. And one of them, the big one really, is the flexibility that we have to create programs that respond to whatever it is that we're dealing with in the moment. So I think DEI is sort of a cottage industry right now. So there are a lot of people who are practitioners, and schools are under a lot of pressure to hire DEI coordinators or directors. And we're in a very different place. We're in a Vermont is very white, but the Northeast Kingdom is particularly white. We have and that presents its own issues. But it means really that our big ism that we're steeped in is classism in the Northeast Kingdom. So it's socioeconomic diversity that is really the most important to focus on for us. Not to say that racial diversity and all LGBT aren't important, because we've been working on all of that. So the reason I mention it is because we have some flexibility to hire somebody who is going to be able to focus on what we want to create that position, right?
Thank you, Chair. So I just think from my point of view, where the dichotomy sits is that many of our schools, public schools, it sounds like your institution, out of goodwill, is deciding to sort of follow the ethnic standards bill and some of the other things, which is fantastic. But there are other schools that obviously they don't have the luxury of goodwill, right? They're held accountable to certain standards and certain rules and policies. And I think that there's a bit of a dichotomy there. I also want to speak a little bit to, and I don't want to speak out of turn, so we can get this fact checked if I'm wrong. And I also don't want to go with a transitive property here, but I do think when the House got testimony from NEASC, that one of the questions they asked is, do you work with and certify schools that are not, do not follow diversity and equity standards, and that also may discriminate against LGBTQ students and so forth? And yet he was not able to answer that question. So, that's something that, again, in terms of like setting a standard, that doesn't sit well necessarily.
I understand that for sure. I think that's one of the reasons that at the state board we talked about doing Vermont specific addendum, and that would be, and I do think that would cover just what you're talking about, and make sure that the Vermont schools that are approved by NEASC and accredited by NEASC have this standard. Total school student.
Following up on that, it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but would that be captured in the 2200 series?
It would,
Okay. I
yes,
just want
it
to make
would,
sure.
yes. So
Okay,
that's how I'm trying to think about it.
yeah,
Is, that the 2200 series is really meant for the independent schools, and then EQS is meant for public schools. And I'm not for or against EQS.
Yeah.
Because, I'm for and against standards. So the fact that we have these two mechanisms, to me, making a transition to EQS is just, it doesn't make sense for us structurally, and also just in terms of restructuring our, transitioning to a new accountability mechanism.
yeah. So just to follow up then, because I think you covered this a little bit when you were in. 2200 series is basically saying you cannot take public funds if you're discriminating against
Mhm.
LGBTQ families.
That's right.
And we passed a bill last year that has to
Yeah.
pass that, we tried this, we heard from some people that needed to be stood up even
Mhm.
stronger.
Mhm.
That's why we passed it.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure that
But that's already there.
that is there.
Mhm.
And then the other thing I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind saying a word about admissions.
Mhm.
Because the other thing out there, and I think we talked about this a little bit, is, can you tell us about the selectivity? I mean, who goes, who doesn't go, that kind of thing.
Sure.
From the district, I'm talking about, because you serve as a high school.
Yes, and I do want to mention, and I think I just sort of went straight at classism, but we also have 188 boarding students, and many of them are international students. So we also do have a lot of racial diversity that we are attending to.
Senator Hewlett just stands there to keep an eye on me. Don't let it.
Fair enough. Some wonderful things written about this. Well, I'll just, we accept all comers.
Okay.
That is just full stop.
Okay.
Our admissions materials and our application used to ask questions that were interpretable as questions that would affect your admission. Like, do you have a disability? And how much, what's your socioeconomic status? So they used to ask those questions, but now we have none of those questions, basically, because it's not a factor. Those things are not a factor in our admission. They're a factor in enrollment when we want to support a student. But essentially, any student that a public school would take, we will take. Only those who are a danger to themselves and others, or who have needs that are beyond what we can provide, medical needs or other kinds of needs. And those are the students who I think that's why the therapeutic schools are also in the kind of part of the conversation, because they're really, really important to us and to public schools. So in terms of admission, I don't know what more there is to say about it, quite frankly. We bring them in and we want to understand the best way to serve them, and have a special service. If special services is kind of at the center of this, which I think it often is, we have beefed up our special services in ways that so we actually can serve students that we wouldn't have been able to serve 5-6 years ago, with the reading and writing lab, but with interventions that are very specific, with one-on-one paras. We just didn't have that.
Additional questions?
No, thank you.
Good. Good. Yeah. Mr. Fannin, you've joined us. You pop in sometimes around appropriate times that you might want to weigh in. Do you have some constructive criticism for St. John's Berry Academy? Is that why you're here?
I didn't know he was back.
No, thank you.
No constructive criticism.
I was
100%
here,
approval rating?
I was
Yeah,
in the building and.
Right.
Listening.
yeah, thank you. Okay. Ms. Pelosi, you're here as well. You don't always pop in, but I think the two of you are working together.
Yes, I represent St. John's Berry Academy.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much for.
Really
having me. I
appreciate you coming
appreciate
back in. Yeah, it does make a difference, frankly, when you can come in person.
Yeah.
It's- Yeah.
So I get to drive in the country.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Committee at 4 o'clock, we are hearing from the president of the state colleges. We would love to keep that. Yeah.
please, that's for you.
I'm gonna pass it right to Senator Bueller.
Been there, done that.
And the provost on the library announcement. So hopefully what we can do is start to pull apart what exactly they're planning on doing. Help us. I know everybody's inbox, some more than others, is filling up on this issue. So we will come back. Yes.
Oh, I was gonna say, if you want me to squeeze my testimony in right now, I could. We could also wait.
Let's wait 5 minutes. Is that all right?
Sure.
I want to gear up. I've got a bunch of questions. I'm gonna use the bathroom and I want to, yeah, all right.
Okay.